Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today, this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. We want to thank you for coming to this talk from author, educator, environmentalist, and one of my personal heroes, Bill McKibben. It's such an honor to have Bill with us today. Thank you, Bill. It's great to see so many familiar faces and also great to see so many faces I don't recognize. Welcome to any of you joining from outside of the Terra.do community. My name is Greg Findley. I'm director of Terra.do's 12-week flagship course, Climate Change Learning for Action. This talk today is the keynote for our most recently launched Bison cohort of our Climate Change Learning for Action course. And it's also one of the expert guest talks for the fellows in our ongoing axolotls cohort. These two cohorts together represent around 250 fellows from more than 22 different countries, and they come from a broad range of professional backgrounds. They are teachers, entrepreneurs, project managers, software engineers, transitioning oil and gas sector workers, journalists, bankers, farmers, activists, and scientists, and all are looking to apply their skills to solving climate change. The Learning for Action course is an intensive exploration of climate science, climate impacts, and climate solutions. And it is a combination of written classes, live weekly lab sessions, deep dives, and expert guest talks and workshops, all intended to help fellows learn about climate change so they can find their role in working to address it. Terra.do was founded in 2020 with an ambitious goal of getting 100 million people working on climate change this decade. To achieve this goal, we offer a combination of climate education, connections to employers and climate jobs, and a supportive community of people who want to make a difference on climate change. You can check out our programs at Terra.do on the web, and you can download our app available on the Apple App Store and Google Play. We offer a new cohort of our Learning for Action course starting every 6 weeks, and we urge you to check it out if you want to learn more about how you can become involved in addressing climate change. Our next cohort begins June 12th, and in honor of Speaker Bill McKibben's newest organization, you can get 20% off of our next cohort if you enter the code Third Act as you register for the course. I would love to encourage you all to check out thirdact.org to learn more and to get involved with this incredible organization, which organizes people over the age of 60 to work on climate and racial justice. Before we get started, I want to go over just a few points about this Zoom session. Please mute yourself so we can all hear our speaker. Following the talk, we should have some time for questions and answers, although we are limiting the questions to our current fellows in the Learning for Action program who will use an online question and answer program platform. Fellows, you can find the Slido link and a message about this talk in your cohort's Slack channel. Before we get started, though, I'd love to pass this to Kamal Kapadia, co-founder of Terra.do and the creator of our Climate Change Learning for Action course, and she can introduce Bill for us. Thanks, Kamal.
Thank you, Greg. I am so honored and excited to introduce Bill McKibben. I shared last week on Twitter that I first encountered Bill McKibben through his book, The End of Nature, when I was in college in Mumbai, India. This was 1993, and I was a first-year student and already interested in some local environmental issues, chiefly waste management at the time. But I had never heard of climate change or the ozone hole or even acid rain until I found Bill's book in my college library. Now, even though it's been 30 years since I read the book, I can remember very clearly the effect it had on me. On reading the book, I went through what can only be described as a revolution of the mind and heart. Not one, but many light bulbs went off in my head, and I felt as if something very, very important and urgent and scary, but also motivating had been revealed to me. Bill, your book set off a fire in me. I felt like I had to spread this message. I had to convert others to the cause of caring for our planet. And so began my long journey as an environmentalist. I'll also note that when I shared this briefly on Twitter, a very prominent climate scientist, Zeke Housefather, also posted that he had read the same book and it had turned him onto working on climate change too. So if Zeke and I both had this experience, Bill, you can be sure you've touched countless of others and converted them into environmentalists and climate activists, and more broadly, inspired and motivated millions into cherishing and caring for this earth. Of course, your accomplishments go way beyond the one book, so let me introduce you more fully to our audience. Bill McKibben is a contributing writer to The New Yorker and a founder of Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60 to work on climate and racial justice. He founded the first global grassroots climate campaign, 350.org, and serves as the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. In 2014, he was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, in the Swedish parliament. He's also won the Gandhi Peace Award and honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. He's written over a dozen books about the environment, including his first, The End of Nature, published in 1989, and his latest book, The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon, a graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. On that note, over to you, Bill, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, Kamal, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And I really like the picture of you getting to read that book and pretty much near the time when it was written. And that's what authors like to hear above all. I was 28 when I wrote The End of Nature. It came out in 1989 originally. It was the first book about what we now call climate change, what we then called the greenhouse effect, for a general audience, which is really, so that, I mean, that puts a bound on about how long this has been a public issue in the world. It's the biggest thing that ever happened, but we haven't had an extraordinary amount of time to deal with it, and we've mostly wasted the time that we do have. So I'm going to do my best to kind of bring things up to date here. I have a feeling that this is all, much of it is old news for you guys, for all you axolotls and yaks and vaquitas and tigers and bison and everybody else who are here. But it's always useful to kind of to have a sense of right where we are at the moment, both in terms of the science and really in terms of the science, the technology, the politics, and hence the tasks at hand. And I'll try to do that for maybe about half an hour, and then we'll have some time for questions and things. I mean, basically, the really tragic part is we knew everything in 1989 that we know now about climate change. It's not really like we've learned anything much of huge importance since those very early days. Our basic understanding that burning hydrocarbons produced CO2, that the molecular structure of CO2 trapped heat, that would begin to heat up the planet, was correct. The predictions of how much it would heat up was correct. The predictions of how much damage that heating would do were turned out to be underestimates, and we've seen more damage than we would have thought from the increment of warmth. But basically, the story is proceeding very much as we had thought. I think the main thing that we didn't understand, which I will return to in a little while, is how difficult it was going to be to get the powerful forces in our society to pay attention to this warning and to act on it. And that failure has been enormous and dispiriting and dangerous, but there are things we can do about that. So first, let's talk about just where we stand right now. We've raised the temperature of the Earth now somewhat over 1 degree Celsius, closing in on 1.2 or so, which is a lot already. That's the heat equivalent every day of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized explosions. And when you think about it in units like that, it's easy to kind of emotionally understand the scale of the damage that we've been doing. Most of the summer sea ice in the Arctic is now melted. So this continent-sized, meters-thick, millennia-old sheet of ice is now largely slush in much of the year, if it's not open water. And that's begun to have enormous and measurable effects. We think that the path of the jet stream is now changing in dramatic ways because of that loss of much of the temperature differential between the equator and the North Pole. And with that, big shifts in weather patterns. We think that we know that the flow of the Gulf Stream, of the Atlantic meridional overturning current, is already dropped about 15% as fresh water pours off Greenland into the North Atlantic, reducing the density differences that drive those big currents. We now, as of a few weeks ago, have pretty powerful evidence that the same thing is happening fast in the Southern Ocean. A really dismaying study indicating that the Antarctic overturning current is beginning to shut down, and that we can plausibly expect it to diminish by 40% by 2050 on current patterns as that water pours off the Antarctic into that ocean. And we can see the effects on extreme weather events more and more easily and profoundly. I think the thing to focus on right now is that we've had remarkable and anomalous weather events over the last 2 or 3 years, which is particularly scary because those 2 or 3 years have been La Nina years in the Pacific, which should have been depressing the global temperature to some degree. And yet we've seen truly extraordinary events. The scariest, well, there have been a number of very scary things. One that really caught the attention of scientists was the June 2021 heat dome over the Pacific Northwest and Canada. In places with well-established temperature records, if we're breaking those records, it should be rarely, and it should be by 1/10 of a degree or so when that happens. That's just the nature of long-lived statistical records. Instead, in June of 2021, June of 2022, across Canada, 2021, we saw a truly anomalous event. We broke the old temperature records for vast swaths of the interior Northwest by 8 degrees Fahrenheit. That should be completely statistically impossible. There was a town in British Columbia where the temperature got to 121 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a higher temperature than's ever been recorded in Europe or in South America. Almost certainly the hottest temperature in Canada for millions of years. And the town where that happened the next day burned to the ground in a complete and devastating forest fire. And then last summer, we saw devastating heat waves across Asia, beginning early with record temperatures in the spring in India and Pakistan. And then in China for much of the summer, just unrelenting record heat. There are a number of weather stations in China for whom all 30 of the hottest days on record come in summer of 2022. And it was not cooling down much at night, which is the real signature of the era we're moving into. And then when the autumn came, that devastation turned to rain and flood. As you all know, warm air holds more water vapor than cold, so we've set things up to allow storms or rainstorms of unprecedented magnitude. And the one in Pakistan last autumn was probably the biggest rainstorm since Noah. It just started raining and did not stop. Parts of Balochistan and Sindh had 800% of their average annual rainfall come down in 3 weeks. There's no way to prepare for rain like that. This is a part of the world where mud brick architecture is often standard and a very useful and good building material until it rains without stop for 3 weeks, and then people's homes just melt out from around them. And that's what happened. 33 million people were affected. Extraordinary displacement, that some of which continues to this day. And of course, the thing to bear in mind, as always, is the root unfairness of all of this. There's closing in, I think, on 200 million Pakistanis, but together they've produced less than 1% of the carbon in the atmosphere, so not their fault. Always worth reminding those of us who are Americans that the 3% of the world's planet who calls themselves Americans have produced 25% of the world's CO2. So that's where we've stood over the last couple of years. Now we're at a very interesting moment, because that La Nina is coming to an end, and all the predictions are that we'll see El Nino warming current in the Pacific beginning sometime between this month and September. And some of the early indications are that it may be a very strong El Nino when it comes. Even if it's just a standard garden variety one, it will mean that 2024 will set almost certainly a new all-time global temperature record, beating the one from the last El Nino in 2016. And if it's a stronger El Nino, the predictions at the moment from the people that I trust are that we could easily go past, for a while anyway, the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise mark that we've been using as a kind of benchmark for what to avoid. We're almost certainly going to go past that permanently sometime in the next 10 years, but we will nose above it probably in 2024, or quite likely in 2024. And if we do, well, in any event, we're going to see new levels of havoc and chaos, because there's just more energy in this system with each passing year. It's worth paying attention to now, in particular, because this may be one of the last of these El Nino record-setting moments that comes when we still have some kind of political room to maneuver here and make big shifts. As you know, the IPCC has told us that we need to cut emissions in half by 2030 to have any chance of staying on our Paris pathway. And so this will be the last probably of these events in that politically relevant time frame. But at any rate, buckle up. It's going to be a serious, a stretch of heavy climate coming our way, and with important but unpredictable consequences in all kinds of ways. So that's new development one. New development two is the ongoing and quite remarkable rapid fall in the price of renewable energy. This is really the story of the last decade, this 90% plummet in the price of energy from the sun and the wind, and a fairly comparable and rapid fall in the price of battery storage for when the sun goes down or the wind drops. And this is, sometime in the last 3 or 4 years, this decline passed some invisible line where it became cheaper than hydrocarbon generation of electricity. That is to say, we live now on a planet where the cheapest way to produce energy is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. And I don't think that that's totally penetrated yet the understanding of most people. I think we continue to view renewable energy as alternative energy, and assume that it's more expensive, but that's not true anymore. It now is the most baseline of energies, and that really is a significant thing. I wrote a piece last year for the New Yorker going through all the numbers about this and saying what it really means is that human beings, for the first time in 700,000 years, have a realistic, plausible path towards ending large-scale combustion on our planet. You know, combustion has sort of defined us. Darwin said fire and language were the two things that set humans apart. When we started doing it millennia ago, we were able to cook food, and hence we got a large brain. We could migrate north and south from the equator. The anthropologists think that, standing around the campfire all night for eons helped us develop the social bonds that now we poorly attempt to substitute with on Zoom. And then, when we learned during the Industrial Revolution to control the combustion of coal and gas and oil, it's what produced modernity and everything around us. So it's been good for us by and large, I guess, but the drawbacks are now enormous and outweighing the benefits. The climate crisis being the most obvious, but not the only one. We have good data from about a year ago, finally, really big meta studies demonstrating that about one human being in 5 dies from, one death in 5 is the result of breathing the byproducts of fossil fuel combustion. And those of you who've been spending time in Delhi or Rawalpindi or someplace in recent years have some idea about this, just how foul the air has become. But it's true almost everywhere. I mean, even in the US, huge numbers of cases of childhood asthma, millions of them linked to having to breathe air fouled by combustion. And of course, in the last year or so, we've been reminded of the other cost of depending on a resource that's only available in a few places. There's only so many deposits of coal and gas and oil, and hence the people who control those deposits become much more powerful than they should. Most recent example, Vladimir Putin, who's converted his oil and gas revenues into a land war in Europe. And an endless assault on the civilians of Ukraine. And so there are more reasons than ever to imagine how nice it would be to take advantage of this new technological boost and, to turn off the fires here on Earth and come to rely as completely as possible on that burning ball of gas 93 million miles up in the sky that produces the rays we can catch on photovoltaic panels and differentially heats the earth in the ways that produce the wind that blow those turbines. Look, I mean, we now have a choice that we haven't had before: energy from hell or energy from heaven. And if we make the right choice fast, we may get out of some of the predicaments that we're in. Third development, not new, but ongoing, we're not moving as fast as we should. And the biggest reason is the ongoing efforts of the fossil fuel industry to prevent us from doing so. Their incredible desire to cling to their business model, long past the point when scientists have explained how ruinous it is the most darkest story of our time. In the last 2 or 3 years, outright climate denial has tended to be replaced by equally dangerous strategies of climate delay or of full-on intensive greenwashing, where fossil fuel industries pretend that they are hard at work on solving our problems, but in fact, they're continuing to do what they've always done. And that is powerful in the politics of much of the world. Some places it's very obvious, like the US. Some places, I think, somewhat less obvious, but still very powerful. I'm always reminded that when Modi ran for office in India, he campaigned using the private jet of the Adani company, the biggest coal firm in the world, for instance. So you see this everywhere, and you see it at the center of too many places. The next conference of the parties, the next climate negotiations this November are taking place in Abu Dhabi, and the chair of the negotiations is also the head of the Abu Dhabi oil company, which has announced a plan to dramatically expand oil and gas production over the next decade. So these are powerful currents. And so the fourth thing then is the ongoing development of efforts in civil society to stand up to that power and push change fast. And I'll make just a couple of points here. First is that the pandemic made it difficult for some of that civil society work to continue. Just as we were going into the pandemic, a kind of global concern about climate change was cresting. September 2019, Greta and her friends organized a global climate strike that had 10 million people in the street, probably the high water mark of climate protest. But it's now coming back and strongly. And we're doing our best to spread it out across not only geographies, but generations. Much of the fighting has been done by young people over the years. I started 350.org with 7 college students. It became the first iteration of a global climate movement. We did things like launch this fight against the Keystone Pipeline that was ultimately successful, and launch this vast fossil fuel divestment movement that's become the biggest anti-corporate campaign of its kind ever. We're at about $40 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested. Young people did most of that work because a lot of it was done on university campuses. When they graduated from university, they wanted to keep going, so they formed the Sunrise Movement that brought us the Green New Deal in this country. And that Green New Deal was the father of the climate bill that finally passed the Congress last year, providing money for America to begin a more systematic transition to clean energy. And so let's go there. That means, and this technological maturation means, that a certain amount of the movement building that's been underway and been focused on standing up to the fossil fuel industry now needs also to be about execution and deployment of new technology. And that's partly a task that, markets will accomplish given the right incentives. But given the fact that we need to do it fast, it's going to need serious push from civil society. We look at the United States, where we now have $300 or $400 billion to do, heat pumps and EV chargers and so on and so forth. But it doesn't happen automatically. There still has to be some way to get people enlisted and organized, and we have to be able to do things like train 1 million new electricians in the US alone in order to implement deploy technologies. So tons of work for movements to do. And I've been, as Kamal said, most involved in the last couple of years in this new gathering work to bring more generations online. We've started Third Act, which organizes people over 60, in part because I heard too many people say, well, it's up to the next generations to solve these problems. The next generations, as I've said, are doing their job. Greta, who's one of my favorite people to work with in the world, would be the first to tell you there are 10,000 Gretas around the world. There really are amazing young leaders. And as I say, they have 10 million followers out on the street. But young people lack the structural power to make the change we need on the scale we need in the time we have. And one of the groups that has a lot of structural power is older people. In the United States, for instance, there are 70 million of us over the age of 60. We all vote all the time, so we're politically powerful. And we ended up with most of the money, about 70% of the financial assets in the country. So if you wanted to push around Washington or Wall Street, you know, having some people with hairlines like mine would be useful. And that's what we've been doing, lots and lots of organizing. Some of you may have seen, we just came off a big national day of action with 100 demonstrations around America aimed at the 4 big American banks, Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are also the world's 4 biggest lenders to the fossil fuel industry. We want them to stop. And so we were organizing all kinds of, you know, people cutting up their credit cards, and we closed down a lot of banks for the day. I was in Washington, D.C., where we had the support of the other big NGOs in the environmental fight, the Sierra Club and Greenpeace and things. And we shut down those 4 banks for the day by, since we're old and don't want to sprawl on the sidewalk for hours, we had hundreds of rocking chairs out front. And that's what we used to block the doors and lock them down. And the New York Times called it the Rocking Chair Rebellion. We had a big banner that said "Fossils against fossil fuels." So we're doing our best to try and back up the young people in this work, and it's I think going reasonably well. So that's kind of my update. The science is very dire. The speed at which things are now changing is, I think, should be sobering to everyone, because we're in these series now of feedback loops that are very hard to control. The rapid melt at the poles in particular is sets off an almost endless series of dangerous feedback loops. But the technology is more promising than it's ever been. We basically have a sense of the way out in terms of rapid deployment of clean energy technology and that we're capable of doing it at a local and regional level that's good. The politics of that are difficult as always because the current business model has been so profitable and lucrative that the people who benefit from it will stand up for it until the last minute. And so the challenge continues to be organizing people on large scale to try and change that politics as quickly as we can. Those strike me as the key variables in play right now. And makes me very, very glad that there are people there doing the kind of work that y'all are doing to try and understand and then influence the situation that we're in. It could not be more important. And just speaking for myself, I could not be more grateful. And just to be able to say thank you to y'all for being a big part of this fight. It's by far the most important fight that humans have ever gotten themselves into. We don't know the outcome. At a certain level, it strikes me that our response to climate change is a kind of test of whether or not the big brain was a good evolutionary adaptation or not. It got us into a lot of trouble. We'll see if it gets us out. My guess is actually that more important than the size of the brain may turn out to be the size of the heart that the brain is connected to. And that's why I think that the kind of cultural, spiritual, social dimensions of this question are at least as interesting as the technological ones. And they're the things that I spend most of my time working on. And I just, as I say, couldn't be more grateful that there are so many able and talented people pouring their lives into this. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Bill, so very much for joining us and for inspiring us over all these years and for all that you have done to really open many of our eyes to this crisis and things that we can do about it. So thank you so very much. We do have a number of questions that people have posted here, and I'm going to combine the first two questions together, or the most upvoted questions together, because they go together. And the first is, how do you counter the argument that renewables are not sustainable because of rare earth mineral mining? And then Will also asks, any ideas on how to fight the right-wing misinformation campaigns, such as that solar panels are toxic, or I live in Wyoming, everyone here says that windmills are filling up our landfills, et cetera.
Well, yeah, very good questions. Look, there is no free lunch, and producing as much energy as humans use, or even half as much energy as humans use, is always going to be hard, and it's going to come with costs. And the question is, how big are those costs relative to the other ways of producing that energy? So, job one, it would be smart to use less energy. And I think that's one of the things we can work on over time, but humans used a lot of it. You do need to mine rare earth minerals and lithium and cobalt and things in order to produce renewable energy. And that can be done badly, or it can be done better, and we should push to make it be done better. But even at its worst, its scale doesn't even begin to approach what we're doing now. The guess is that the total mining burden on the planet would drop by some considerable factor, maybe 80%, if we were running on renewable energy. And if you think about it for a moment, it's not hard to figure out why. If you mine some lithium or rare earth minerals or cobalt or whatever, you mine it once and then you put it in your battery or your turbine or your solar panel, and there it sits for the next 25 years doing its job. And then with most of these things, we can recycle them when that time is done and get it ready for the next machine. By contrast, if you power your world on coal, you dig it up, and then what do you do with it? You immediately set it on fire, at which point you have to go mine a whole bunch more the next day. A way to visualize this is 40% of all the ship traffic in the world is just carrying coal and gas and oil back and forth around the world to be burned. And that's unnecessary, because the sun orbits the Earth and will deliver energy when it rises above the horizon every day. And so it's, this transition is a way to begin to reduce the intensity of our use of the planet. We should worry very much about the people who have to mine this stuff and do what we can to make those conditions as good as possible. And there is at least some work underway around this. But remember that other number I told you a minute ago. 9 million people on this planet die every year from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. Almost all of them poorer, and in more vulnerable communities. So there could be an awful lot of damage done from an awful lot of other things that before you got anywhere even remotely close to that level of damage, that's 1 death in 5 on this planet. So yeah, I mean, if you're looking for a perfect answer for how to power the Earth, there isn't one. Our job is to find better answers that do less damage in the here and now and no damage particularly at all over sort of geological timescales, unlike coal and gas and oil, which are doing enormous damage just from pollution every day and are also utterly destroying our future.
Thank you. Enid asks a question that also got a number of upvotes, and it says, given the selection of the UAE as the location and an oil executive as the head of the next COP28, is this event still meaningful? And what can be done to remove political barriers to real conversations and real change?
Well, in the short run, I think there's a lot of building sentiment for boycotting this year's COP. I don't know what's going to happen, and the final call will probably come from the people at the Climate Action Network, who, around the world and especially in the global South, who have been skillfully using these negotiations to at least begin to advance things like compensation for loss and damage and things. But my sense as an organizer is that we might be better off boycotting this year's and using it as an occasion to just drive home the fact that this sort of greenwashing and co-optation has become the norm. The only way to make it better is just to organize more. Politics, there are no cheat codes. There's no secret. There's no secrets. It's all about power, and power comes either from large sums of money, which is what fossil fuel industry relies on, or it comes from large numbers of people that you can mobilize. And those are the two things capable of putting enough fear into the powerful, or promising them enough of a reward that it can change behavior. And we've seen it happen enough to know that it's possible, but not easy. That's why we just keep building big organizations.
Thank you. There's a question from Kate asking, how do you view the impact of conservation after the fact? I assume this is adaptation compared to climate change prevention and mitigation work. So how do you view those?
We've tended to divide things up into this sort of adaptation, mitigation framework and things. For obvious reasons. And we're obviously going to have to do a lot of adaptation to deal with the trouble we've already caused and are going to cause going forward. But I think that the burden of the new science is that the levels of damage we're seeing with 1 degree increase in temperature are so high that it's made people much, much more worried, made scientists much, much more worried about what kind of damage. We're currently on a trajectory to increase the temperature of the Earth about 3 degrees centigrade by the time the youngest people on this call are as ancient as I am. And I think the understanding now is that those are just inconceivable amounts of damage that come with temperature rises like that. And so the most important adaptation at the moment probably is mitigation, is holding the temperature increase to 2 degrees or maybe a little less if we're really lucky. And that at least produces a world where it's possible to imagine ongoing adaptation to it. If we let it get much beyond that, the scale of change goes beyond our ability to cope. And we're getting there, pretty close to there already. I mean, there was no way for Pakistan to deal with that rainstorm that it had last autumn. There's really not like an adaptation plan that lets you work with 3 weeks of nonstop rainfall, even in rich places. I mean, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, 2 weeks ago, we got 25 inches of rain in 6 hours. There's no way to build a storm sewer large enough to handle water like that, you know. And so I think at this point, slowing down the rate at which we're increasing the temperature of the planet becomes the key job for adaptation and mitigation.
Thanks. Carl asks, in your book, Falter, you talk about a narrative where everything in the world is steadily improving. How do you counter this view without coming across as negative or bleak?
Well, there has been this view that, you know, and there's been some statistical worth to it, you know, that in the decades after World War II, as development spread, we saw big increases in literacy and declines in hunger and so on and so forth. And that's, you know, because of huge amounts of hard human effort to make that happen. The problem is that that's all now being undercut by this rise in temperature and the associated problems that go with it. Malnutrition is currently now obviously on the increase around the world because we keep having weather-related trouble for crop yields, and prices go up and availability goes down. Child labor is clearly on the increase now, because when we have really disruptive natural disasters, that's one of the things that happens. Our ability to meet our strategic development goals, the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, is beyond unlikely on a rapidly warming planet. So I think the way to counter it is to say, look, things got better on this world because we had a series of conditions that allowed them to get better. One of those is a stable climate providing a backdrop against which to do development. We have to get that stable backdrop back if we're going to continue to see increases in human welfare. Otherwise, it's pretty clear we're going to go in the opposite direction. The most basic accounting may turn out to be just number of people who have to actually get up and leave their homes. And that number seems to be, I mean, we now, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees say the number of people who are having to flee because of climatic conditions now far outnumbers the number who are having to flee because of war, which is a fairly significant passage in human history, it seems.
Thanks. Theo asks, of all your published material, what would be the single most relevant for a reader who is just beginning a career transition to climate?
I think maybe I might start with this piece that I referenced from the New Yorker last year, just this essay about the rapid fall in the price of renewable energy and what that means for the chance of ending combustion. And it's called something like, "In a World on Fire, Stop Burning Things." That might be an easy and fairly up-to-date introduction as to where we are right now.
Thanks. That was a great article. I enjoyed it. We also have a question here about concern about balancing the fight against poverty and all the climate consequences of so many people becoming greater consumers as they enter the middle class all over the world. What thoughts do you have on that?
Well, look, it's pretty clear that the planet struggles to have one continent mine consuming at the rate that it does. It's pretty clear that the planet, for a wide variety of reasons, including climate ones, can't have everybody on the planet consuming like Americans. It's pretty clear that if Americans keep consuming the way they do, lots of other people are going to try and emulate them. So someplace in those, in those things that are clear, we're going to have to figure out some ways to break the cycle. Um, over the long run, I think that we will. I think that I've written a lot about this. I think the weakness of the biggest problem with consumption, beyond the fact that it wrecks the planet, is that it makes us less happy than it insists it will. And I think eventually that's its Achilles heel. And over time, human beings will figure out much more interesting ways to be inhabiting the planet, and that we won't just be shopping all the time and whatever. But truthfully, I think that'll take a while. And I think one of our jobs in the coming decades is to provide enough energy to allow us to do the things that we're going to do without destroying the planet, thus preserving the possibility that the next set of people who come along will be able to build far more interesting um, um, civilizations than societies than the ones we have at the moment. And I think we see the seeds of a lot of that in the extraordinary work and witness from indigenous communities and from lower consuming communities of the global South that are providing really interesting and powerful examples about different ways to live on this earth. But I don't think that we're going to take advantage of those so fast that it will obviate the need for making technological transition to cleaner energy along the way. So my goal at this point, I must say, in my own life, is to help us stumble along through the next few the bottleneck of the next few decades, with a planet intact enough that younger people will still have a planet on which to do some interesting things, um, and I have full faith that they will do those more interesting things if we manage to get them through with a planet to play with,
We have another question here that says, I am a fan of the impacts achieved by the divestment movement. What other similar actions, strategies would you recommend we look into in order to learn from?
Well, thank you. And the divestment movement has been quite successful. It's one of the reasons now why we're going after banks, asset managers, and insurance companies. Not with divestment, we're not telling people to sell their stock in these banks and things, but instead to pressure these guys to change their way of doing business, so that they're no longer helping the fossil fuel industry. And so there's big work being done. I was describing some of the work around banks. Asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard are the biggest owners of of everything on the planet. $1 in 8 in the world sits in BlackRock's digital vaults, So they have effective control over zillions of companies, and exercised wisely could make a huge difference. And the insurance industry turns out to be an equally interesting target. The insurance industry is the part of our capitalist enterprise that we ask to analyze risk for us. It does a good job of it. They have, all the data to show just how damaging climate change is, and yet other parts of the same companies are busy investing in fossil fuel, and even more dangerously, underwriting new pipelines, new fracking wells, things like that. You couldn't build a pipeline across East Africa like they're trying to do now if some insurance company wasn't willing to write the policies that allowed it to happen. And insurance is actually a perfect example of just how dumb our whole predicament is. I mean, the basic technology of the insurance industry is the actuarial table, which is a great human invention, one of the most important human inventions of all time, because we wouldn't do anything on a large scale, like even, build a house maybe or something, unless we could figure out a way to hedge the risk somewhat. And that's what an actuarial table allows you to do. The only problem with an actuarial table, the only problem with this technology is it depends on the planet behaving in the future more or less as it behaved in the past. And so we need to, in order to keep this tool useful and underpinning our global economy, we need to try and figure out how to how to get the insurance industry to change. And I see that in this chat, someone has been underlining the work that the Sunrise Project does along these lines. Not the Sunrise Movement, that's different, the Sunrise Project, an Australian-based operation that's been doing a great job taking on financial institutions around the world, and that I get to work pretty closely with. So there's a ton to be done, and y'all are doing it. And I just, as we close here, I just really, really, really want to say thanks to Kamal, to Greg, to everybody at Terra.do, but also to all of you who are signing up to do this work. And I'll just finish by saying that, it's a relatively small number of human beings who ever get to say in the course of their lives, I'm doing the single most important thing that I could possibly be doing on the planet right now. There's a certain kind of burden that comes with knowing about climate change and having to work on it, but there's also a great honor and great privilege that comes with doing it, with getting to, really be able to have a significant effect on the outcome of the single biggest question that our species has ever grappled with. So many, many thanks to you all for taking that on. And I look forward to seeing you all down the road, wherever, in jail or, at the solar farm or wherever it is that we all have to figure out where to be next to make all this happen. So many thanks.
Thank you, Bill, so very much. As someone just put in the chat, it's such a treat to hear you speaking to us at Terra.do. So thank you very much for all that you do. And thank everyone else for joining us today. It's such an honor to have Bill McKibben and to have all of you here listening and working on this problem together. So thanks all. And I'll share the recording for others later. Take care.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Thank you all
very much.
Our next keynote speaker is Tom Steyer on June 14th. So sign up for our next cohort of Climate Change Learning for Action if you want to have special access to the Q&A with Tom Steyer.
Thank you, everyone at Terra. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Hannah.
Thanks, Leanne.
Keeping us inspired. Thanks so much. Keep it up. Bye-bye.
Take care.